Hi everyone, Alexander here, and we're back for another installment of 30 Days of Symphony, but not just any installment, because today we begin to climb together one of the summits of classical music, the journey that is the symphonies of Johannes Brahms, that composer who finally emerged in the early 1870s as the one true successor to Ludwig van Beethoven as a composer of symphonic music. Now, as you may have learned in school, it took Brahms well into middle age to finally complete a full-scale symphony. By the time of the premiere of the Symphony No. 1 in 1876, Brahms was 43 years old. Now, back in the mid-19th century, he was no spring chicken, okay? So this is well into middle age that he finally takes on the challenge of making himself appear as a successor to Beethoven. But the road to that premiere of the Symphony No. 1, which we'll get to tomorrow, was a long and tortured road. Brahms was born in 1833 in a working-class tenement in the northern German port city of Hamburg. Now, there's been a lot of myth-making about Brahms's youth and the fact that he went through his entire life a single man. Pop psychology being what it is, it's often been said that, oh, poor Brahms, as a boy, he had to play piano in a brothel to make ends meet, and he had to consort with prostitutes, and this scarred him for life. Or, the other theory that Brahms was a closet homosexual, and that's why he never married. Well, Brahms never in his life expressed any neurosis whatsoever about his upbringing. He grew up in humble circumstances, but he loved his parents. He knew that his parents had given him the best life that they could. And he was a man who just wanted to be alone. He wanted to be independent. And he went through his life with some of the greatest friendships of the 19th century. Most famously, his profoundly close and complicated friendship with the great pianist Clara Schumann, the wife of his mentor, the composer Robert Schumann. Well, I think of Schumann a lot as I think of Brahms's early tries at symphonic writing, because when Brahms was born in 1833, the 1830s were literally represented a lost generation for the Central European symphony. Beethoven dies in 1827. At that point, the young, very young Franz Schubert thinks that now he can succeed Beethoven as the musical big man of Vienna. And he writes that glorious, his own Ninth Symphony, the Great C Major. But alas, poor Schubert, who is slowly dying of syphilis, will be dead within a year. In the 1830s, and 40s and 50s, actually very few symphonies are written in Germany. It's not that hundreds of them were composed and they've all deservedly fallen into obscurity. It's just that actually very few composers wanted to take on the mantle of being, attempting to be seen as the successor to Beethoven. By the early 40s, two composers emerge, like Beethoven and Schubert. We rightly see them as kind of pendants to each other. Felix Mendelssohn and his great sister Fanny Mendelssohn, very much a musical team, and the other great musical team, husband and wife, Robert and Clara Schumann. During their illustrious and also tragically truncated careers, Mendelssohn Schumann loses his mind, and Mendelssohn, literally, like Mozart, works himself to death. But both composers, in their own special ways, tried to find their own individual way of being a successor to Beethoven. Mendelssohn, quite openly, goes backwards. Mendelssohn is the first, what we call, neoclassical composer. He goes back from his being a great child prodigy like Mozart. He immediately goes back to the past, to the generation before Beethoven, the world of Bach and Mozart, and writes in this deliberately neoclassical style that has very profound influences from Romantic painting and poetry, and tries to find a kind of a third way to move forward as this neoclassical composer. For Schumann, everything is a song. Everything is derived in poetry. Schumann himself loved to write poetry. Mendelssohn, interestingly, was also a great amateur painter. But Schumann at heart is a poet, a tortured, tragic figure who will eventually go insane. But like Hector Berlioz in Paris, he's not only one of the great composers, he's also a great music critic, and he publishes his own newspaper of music criticism. It's in 1853, while Schumann by this point is descending into the depths of his own insanity, that Robert and Clara Schumann welcome to their home a 20-year-old unknown composer from Hamburg named Johannes Brahms. It's fair to say that in their own distinct ways, both Robert and Clara fall in love with this strikingly handsome, young, blonde, boy, really, 20 years old, who looks like some young Nordic god of Norse mythology, who Robert Schumann, immediately decides that here he has found the great savior of German music, much like Wagner writes his opera about Lohengrin. This whole, in mid-19th century Germany, you have to remember, these are the days before the consolidated, confederated German Empire, that, old Kaiser Wilhelm, leading into World War I. This is a pre-1866 Germany that's literally a collection of little dukedoms and princely states, and German culture, year by year, as we go through the 19th century, keeps wondering that why can't they have their own unified identity? It's not only expressed in politics by people like Otto von Bismarck in 1850s, 60s, 70s, but composers like Schumann saying, why can't we have our own unified voice? Well, he thinks he's found it in poor, beautiful, young, brilliant, beautiful young Johannes Brahms. You can imagine the pressure on this poor working class kid from Hamburg that's suddenly been thrown onto his shoulders. Brahms takes his own sweet time to write a symphony. In the 1850s, he begins a symphony in D minor, but eventually realizes that it's better made into a piano concerto. That becomes the Brahms First Piano Concerto. Actually, almost an ungainly work because it sounds like a symphony with an occasional solo piano part. So there we are. He writes a sonata for two pianos that Clara Schumann immediately says he must turn into a symphony. It's like when Schumann first met Brahms, the young Brahms played Schumann his early piano sonatas, and Schumann declared that these works were veiled symphonies. Clara says this sonata for two pianos must become a symphony. Brahms, in his complicated friendship with Clara, never gives in, and that work eventually becomes his immortal piano quintet. In the late 1850s, Brahms, who is having to make his own way as a freelance musician, gets his first big break. He becomes the court musician, the chief, what they would call a Kapellmeister, the chief kind of pianist and all-around director of music of this German princely town of Detmold. The Prince of Detmold and his wife were great amateur music lovers, and they give this plum job to the young Brahms, where he's paid a modest but decent salary, and he's got time to compose. It's in the late 1850s that he writes what becomes not his first symphony, but the work that I present to you now as, if you will, the prequel to the Brahms symphonies. His first Serenade, not symphony, Serenade in D major for orchestra, his opus 11. This, on the surface, is no symphony, but a serenade in 6 movements. Now, you remember all those serenades that Haydn and most famously Mozart wrote as literally dinner party music for their princely employers in the 18th century would always have 5 or 6 movements to keep the action going. And it's, there's a reason why the French name for a serenade is a divertissement, divertissement, just a pleasant entertainment. Each of the 6 movements is an homage to one of his musical predecessors, and it is very, very much a symphony in disguise. And it's because it's a symphony in disguise that the Serenade went through 4 different versions. It started life as a little 3-movement nonette, a little work for 9 players that was like his tribute to the octet of Franz Schubert. It caught on very well with his friends. He then turns it into a 4-movement, then a 6th-movement work for little chamber orchestra, and then finally, as a 6-movement proto-symphony, gives it full orchestral dress, and then it is given its premiere in another great little German city, Hanover, in 1860, with immediate success. Again, on the surface it's a serenade, but beneath the surface it is every inch the symphony with just 2 extra movements. Each movement is an act of homage, as I was saying, to one of his musical forebears. The first movement is almost a thematic lift from the last movement of the very last symphony by Haydn, also in D major, the famous London Symphony, that has that jaunty Croatian folk theme. You'll see how this idea of dee da 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 dee dum dum is actually a riff on Haydn's da da dee da dum bum 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 be da ba. It's a direct and obvious quote, and Brahms is playing with the emotions of his audience because he knows that his audience is going to sense that connection, and he's like fine with that. He knows it. It's like a novelist basing his first novel on the works of other earlier, authors. There's nothing, unethical about it at all. Quite the contrary. The second movement is a very dark, elusive little scherzo, but not a scherzo like a Beethoven symphony. This is his homage to Schumann, the world of late Schumann, dark, neurotic, mysterious, this slithering idea in D minor. Again, D minor being the key of Robert Schumann's last symphony that he wrote on this earth, the famous, heartbreakingly beautiful Symphony number 4 of Schumann in D minor. So this is Brahms's kind of unwritten homage to his mentor, Robert Schumann. The slow movement is his homage to the world of Schubert. Here we have a slow movement that could be in every way, shape, and form the slow movement proper of an absolute Symphony number 1. He saves that for later. But we have a full symphonic slow movement that Beethoven or Schubert would have been proud to have written. I also think of Schumann and Mendelssohn, but it's a little too pastoral for that kind of style. He's really, it's like the Beethoven Pastoral Symphony, but with another 50 years of wisdom attached to it. Just hauntingly beautiful. It's this movement where Brahms gives us the hints of the darker, more burnished and ruminative style of his middle age. For many music lovers, the slow movement is really the core of the entire work. We then get not 1, but 2 minuets. Again, not a scherzo, but an old-fashioned, late 18th century minuet that Mozart would have been happy to have composed. Then, as kind of almost like a throwaway, you think he's going to move into the finale, but instead he gives us another scherzo, in which here he almost literally quotes the trio from the scherzo of Beethoven's early symphony, also in D major, his Beethoven's Symphony number 2. The instrumentation is alike. It's a solo for the French horn, and the theme is almost identical. And again, Brahms knows that his audience is going to know exactly what he's doing, but that's part of the game he's playing. He's saying that he is trying to modestly take his place in this great tradition of Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, and Beethoven. In the last movement, he goes back to the happy rustic style of Haydn, kind of wrapping up this work from where it all began. So here is Brahms's kind of dry run at a full-fledged symphony, this joyous Serenade number 1 for ensemble that then got turned into a symphony orchestra. And here I'm going to do something we usually don't do. And instead of watching a live performance, you get to listen to a performance while looking at the score, because I want you to see how cleanly written this again, proto-symphony is. Like a great work of Beethoven, not one note is out of place. So in all of its beautiful pastoral 6 movements, here, Johannes Brahms's Serenade number 1.